The ship's thrusters hissed into silence as it clamped onto the docking bay of RX-47, its once bustling lights now flickering like the dying embers of a long-forgotten flame. Commander Dorian stood by the hatch, eyes scanning his crew as the final docking protocols completed. They were hardened, each one a survivor of hostile outposts and firefights, yet there was something in the air that even they couldn't quite shake. RX-47 was nothing like the others. Abandoned colonies often came with a messy list of things left behind: old supplies, skeletons of broken machinery, echoing silence. But this one felt wrong. And they all felt it. The hatch hissed open, and Dorian stepped out first, his boots landing on the metal floor with a heavy, muted thud. The air inside was thick and metallic, tainted with the stale, unnatural scent of something long past its prime. The corridors stretched out before them, long veins of metal and shadow that seemed to curl deeper into darkness. He raised his weapon as the others followed, their footsteps swallowed almost immediately by the void around them. The silence was more than just the absence of sound. It was a presence all its own, pressing against them like a great, unseen weight. They moved through the main corridor slowly, each step revealing the station's decay, panels cracked and rusted, lights flickering weakly overhead. The corridor walls were scrawled with faint, hurried etchings, words that had faded and twisted into unrecognizable shapes, like the final breaths of someone desperate to leave a mark. Dorian's gut twisted as he noticed scratches on the walls, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the metal in an attempt to escape. And then they heard it. A scream. It was faint, distant, yet unmistakably human. The sound seemed to snake through the corridors, weaving between the walls with a strange, unnatural echo, as if bouncing between dimensions before reaching their ears. Private Jin froze, her wide eyes flicking to Dorian, her hand clenching around her weapon. The sound hung in the air, raw and piercing, reverberating until it was barely a whisper before finally dissolving into the silence. Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice breaking the silence in a way that felt intrusive, almost blasphemous. Her words echoed softly, twisted in the stillness. Dorian's eyes remained fixed down the hall, his mind racing as he forced himself to stay calm. He had read the reports, skimmed through files on psychological phenomena experienced in abandoned colonies, auditory hallucinations, feelings of paranoia, all exacerbated by the isolation of deep space. But this was different. This wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a spectral remnant of something they couldn't see or explain. Probably just leftover recordings, he muttered, though the words felt hollow even to him. Automated distress signals, maybe. The others nodded, almost desperate to accept it, but their faces betrayed their unease. Dorian motioned for the team to press on, leading them down another twisting corridor. The shadows seemed to deepen, the lights flickering more erratically. Each step felt like it was taking them further away from reality and deeper into something else, something that defied the logic of steel and circuitry. And then the scream came again. This time it was closer, sharper, the kind of scream that came from raw terror. It was as if someone or something was being torn apart. Every ounce of horror seared into that single, chilling sound. But there was something else in the scream, something that made the hair on the back of Dorian's neck rise. It wasn't just a scream. It was layered, almost fractured, with another scream behind it, an echo that distorted and twisted, overlapping like a twisted recording glitch. Yet it didn't sound artificial. It sounded painfully, horrifyingly real. "Commander R, are you sure this place is empty?" muttered Lance Corporal Mira, her eyes wide, darting into the shadows as if she expected something to lunge at them from the darkness. He couldn't give her the reassurance she needed. The colony's records had been clear. Everyone had been accounted for in the initial report. There should have been nothing but silence here. And yet, the screams kept coming, as if woven into the station's very bones, growing louder, more distorted, every time they turned a corner. They reached what had once been the main living quarters, and as they stepped inside, the room seemed to expand into darkness, swallowing their flashlights in a way that felt unnatural. Personal belongings littered the floors, shoes, empty cups, fragments of broken furniture, scattered as though the occupants had fled without a moment's thought. Dorian picked up a photo frame, its glass cracked and the faces behind it smeared and warped. He squinted at the image, but there was something wrong with it, something twisted in the eyes of the people staring back at him. He put it down quickly, fighting a rising nausea. And then, from deeper within the base, the scream returned, louder, sharp enough to pierce their eardrums. Dorian's head snapped up, his heart pounding as the scream twisted again, this time unmistakably in Jin's voice. He turned to see her standing beside him, her face frozen in shock, her own mouth mirroring the terror in the scream. She hadn't spoken, hadn't made a sound, yet her voice filled the corridor, echoing and distorting, splintering into hundreds of fractured, unrecognizable versions of itself. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath, as her own scream echoed back at her from the depths of the station. Dorian's throat tightened, every nerve on edge as he forced himself to move forward. He knew they couldn't turn back, not now, not after coming this far. But as they descended deeper into the station, the walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with every step. The screams became a constant hum, a ghostly soundtrack that grew louder, sharper, each echo twisting into something darker. The sounds weren't just filling the space around them. They were beginning to seep into their minds, clawing at the edges of their sanity, each scream digging deeper into their thoughts like nails into flesh. By the time they reached the core of RX-47, the silence was gone, replaced by an endless cacophony of screams. They were all around them, above them, below them, as if the station itself were alive, pulsing with a desperate, consuming agony. Every sound, every echo seemed to burrow deeper, embedding itself in their minds, twisting their thoughts until the voices weren't just in the walls. They were in their heads. Dorian's last thought as they ventured into the heart of ERX-47 was that he had been wrong. The station wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. By the second day, the station seemed to breathe. Every corridor, every shadowed alcove pulsed with a life all its own, a strange, unnatural rhythm that the rescue team couldn't escape. Sleep had become a distant memory, each member of the crew stuck in a trance-like state, their minds teetering on the edge of panic. RX-47 was more than an abandoned colony. It was a labyrinth of horror, feeding on every anxious heartbeat, every silent, terrified breath. The walls felt closer now, tighter around them, and the lights had all but faded into a sickly, intermittent glow, as if the station itself were watching. The voices had become impossible to ignore. Dorian, who'd managed to hold the team together through countless disasters, found himself losing control. The colony seemed to know his thoughts, twisting his own voice against him in desperate, haunting echoes. At first, it had been random, the occasional scream or whispered plea echoing from the dark, words that could be brushed aside as auditory hallucinations. But as they continued to search the empty, decaying rooms, the voices grew louder and more distinct, taking on familiar tones, slipping into moments that blurred the line between memory and nightmare. It was Private Jin who broke first. She had barely spoken since they'd found her own voice screaming back at her from the shadows on the first day. Her eyes had taken on a glazed, haunted look, darting from wall to wall as if watching unseen figures. The others tried to ignore it, but there was a pervasive, bone-deep fear settling in among them, gnawing at their sanity with relentless whispers. "Do you hear that?" Jin whispered in the dead silence, her voice trembling. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on something unseen just beyond the edge of the corridor. They're talking about us. I can hear them." Commander Dorian frowned, stepping closer, his hand on her shoulder. "It's just echoes, Jin. Leftover recordings. Don't let it get into your head." But even as he spoke, he felt the lie curl around his words, hollow and unconvincing. He could hear it too, the voices shifting and muttering just beneath the threshold of comprehension. They were there, slipping between the spaces in the silence, calling to each of them by name. The voices were no longer random, they were precise, directed, weaving into a pattern of pure, suffocating terror. The others began hearing them too. Corporal Mira refused to turn off her comms, keeping them on a constant, staticky loop just to drown out the faint whispers. She sat with her back against the wall, weapon gripped tightly, her eyes darting wildly in the dim light. "I swear they're saying my name," she muttered, her voice wavering. "I keep hearing it, like they're inside my head." Each corridor felt darker, longer, a descent into a nightmare that seemed to shift and warp with each step. The air grew thick and stale, pressing down on them with a suffocating weight. Every time they passed a corner, the shadows seemed to slither back, curling like fingers reaching out to brush against their skin. And the whispers were relentless, slipping into each of their minds, layering over their own thoughts with voices that felt both familiar and alien. Dorian tried to keep the team moving, pressing forward, hoping to find an explanation in the station's core systems. But with each step, he felt the colony's grip tightening, sinking claws into their sanity. The voices had taken on a rhythmic, insistent quality, each whisper carrying fragments of something familiar, like memories pulled from the depths of their minds and twisted into a grotesque, foreign mimicry. They heard their families' voices, friends who had long since vanished into the void, voices calling to them, urging them to join in the darkness. At night, or what passed for night in the hollow silence of space, Dorian sat alone, his back against the cold metal wall, trying to block out the whispers. But even in silence, his own mind betrayed him. He could hear his father's voice, a gruff and comforting tone that had been his rock as a child, whispering in the same sinister cadence. "You'll never leave, Dorian. This is home now. This is where you belong." He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but they lingered, clawing into his mind like barbs. They weren't alone on RX-47, but he couldn't figure out what was with them or how it seemed to know everything about them. Every voice, every memory. The colony had become something more, a reflection of everything they feared, twisted into echoes that reverberated until they drowned out reason itself. By the third day, the crew had begun to unravel. Lance Corporal Mira, usually steady and unshakable, had taken to muttering to herself, whispering apologies to invisible figures. Her words drifted in and out, fragments of her past mixed with raw, unfiltered terror. She seemed haunted, her eyes vacant, as if she had seen something the others couldn't. At one point, she dropped to her knees, clutching her head and screaming as if something were clawing into her mind, her voice mingling with the endless echo of screams that filled the station. The others could only watch, horrified and helpless, as she fell silent, her eyes glassy and unfocused. The station's whispers grew louder, feeding off their fear, transforming their thoughts into a chaotic blend of voices and memories that seeped into the walls. Each of them began to feel it. The station wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off their minds, drawing strength from each fractured memory and whispered fear. It had become a living nightmare, a parasite burrowing into their minds, stripping away their sense of reality, their very sense of self. Jin approached Dorian in the dim light of the main corridor, her face pale and her eyes hollow. I don't know who I am anymore, Commander," she whispered, clutching her weapon like a lifeline. "I keep hearing my own voice, but it's not me. It's like something else, something trying to be me." She choked back a sob, her hand shaking. "I don't know what's real." Dorian could offer no comfort. His own thoughts had begun to twist, to fracture. His memories felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else, a stranger. The whispers were inside him, gnawing at his thoughts, unraveling his sense of self with a relentless, inhuman patience. Each time he tried to push them out, they dug deeper, like a disease spreading through his mind. When they finally made their way into the central hub, Dorian realized they were lost. Not in the physical sense, but something worse. They had lost themselves to the colony, their identities blurred, their thoughts fractured, twisted into echoes of something far older and far darker than themselves. The hub was empty, abandoned and silent, yet the walls felt alive, pulsing with every heartbeat, every breath, every terrified whisper. RX-47 had become a prison, not just of metal and walls, but of minds and memories. Every sound, every thought became another thread in the colony's web, a constant, suffocating reminder of their isolation. They were alone, and yet not alone, surrounded by an endless, inescapable chorus of screams and whispers that would haunt them until there was nothing left but echoes. As Dorian looked into the hollow eyes of his team, he knew there would be no escape from RX-47. The colony had consumed them, turning them into fragments of its own horror. And as the whispers swelled, filling the air with a cacophony of stolen voices, he felt his own thoughts dissolve into the darkness, becoming just another whisper in the endless, echoing madness. In the heart of RX-47, where the shadows seemed to breathe, something ancient and insidious lurked, hidden beneath the layers of cold metal and fractured screams. Dorian led what was left of his team down a narrow passage that twisted deeper into the colony's inner chambers. They moved slowly, hesitantly, their flashlights casting weak beams that barely penetrated the darkness, as if the shadows themselves were consuming the light. The corridor was claustrophobic, closing in on them as though the walls were flexing and contracting, alive in some grotesque mimicry of breath. It was Jin who finally broke the silence, her voice a cracked whisper. "Commander, do you feel that?" Her hand hovered over her temple, eyes flicking up to the dark ceiling above. "It's like something is crawling inside my head." She shuddered, her face pale and hollow, as though the station had drained the life from her, leaving only an empty shell. Dorian's throat tightened, his own head throbbing with a dull, insistent ache that had become an almost physical weight pressing against his thoughts. They'd all felt it, a quiet, gnawing presence that had crept into their minds, slipping between their thoughts, like a parasite worming its way into the core of who they were. He could feel it too, scratching at his sanity, whispering strange fragments of memory and nightmare, twisting his thoughts until he couldn't tell where his own mind ended and the colony's presence began. They reached the central operations room, a wide, cavernous space filled with the wreckage of monitors and terminals, each one covered in a thin layer of dust and corrosion. The room felt untouched, yet somehow still vibrating with a hidden energy, an invisible pulse that hummed just beneath the surface. Dorian's flashlight swept over the control panels, revealing strange patterns scratched into the metal. Symbols, jagged and twisted, as if left by hands that had long since lost their sanity. But it was the air in the room that stopped them all, thick and unnatural, almost humming with an unseen life. It pressed down on them, filling their lungs with each breath, as if they were breathing in something alive, something conscious. And then, in the silence, Dorian heard it, a faint, pulsing vibration, like the murmur of voices, growing louder with each second. At first, it was just a whisper, a quiet hum. But then it grew, multiplying into layers, each one slightly out of sync, a nightmarish symphony of voices overlapping in a discordant, torturous echo. He recognized the voices, the faint, fractured cries of the colonists, each scream twisted and distorted, yet all too human. But there was something else, a new layer, sharper, raw, with a new kind of agony. The voices of his team. He staggered back, the air thick with a sense of dread that weighed down on him like chains. His hands trembled, the flashlight wobbling as it revealed something floating in the air. A faint shimmer like heat waves rising from the metal floor, but colder, far more unsettling. Slowly, the shimmer took form, translucent figures materializing in the darkness, their shapes vaguely human, but stretched, distorted. He watched, frozen in horror, as one of the shapes twisted toward him, its mouth open in a silent scream, its face an unholy mockery of Jin's terrified expression. Dorian backed away, heart pounding as the shapes multiplied, their ghostly forms wavering in the dim light. They pulsed with an otherworldly energy, each one vibrating with the fractured echoes of human voices, the stolen screams and whispers of everyone who had set foot on RX-47. He could see the others staring in horror, transfixed by the nightmarish shapes that drifted through the room, each one a haunting reflection of themselves, their own faces twisted in pain, mouths open in a silent cry for help. The shapes moved with an eerie fluidity, drifting closer, and Dorian felt a chill crawl up his spine as he saw them more clearly. They weren't just mimicking his team, they were feeding. With every scream, every voice that filled the air, the shapes seemed to grow stronger, more defined, as if they were absorbing the very essence of their humanity. "Commander, what are they?" Jin's voice was a desperate whisper, her eyes locked on the translucent form that hovered just inches away, mirroring her own expression in a grotesque parody. He shook his head, unable to tear his gaze from the spectral figures. "They're parasites," he managed, his voice thick with horror. "They've taken our voices. They're feeding on us, using our memories, our fears." He took a step back, the weight of the realization crushing him. They're trying to become us." The creatures, translucent and shimmering, pulsed with life, each movement a distortion of human form, each echo a fragment of a stolen thought. And as they drifted closer, Dorian felt something cold and slimy coil around his mind, a sensation that burrowed into his thoughts, clawing its way into the deepest recesses of his memory. It was as if the creatures were reaching into him, twisting his mind, forcing him to relive each of his fears, his regrets, every buried memory pulled into the forefront in a chaotic, torturous flood. Jin collapsed to her knees, clutching her head, a guttural scream escaping her lips as one of the creatures hovered above her, its face a distorted reflection of her own. The creature's mouth opened in unison with hers, and from it came her own voice, screaming in terror, amplified and twisted until it became an unbearable screech. The sound filled the room, each echo layering upon itself until it became a cacophony of suffering, a wall of sound that shattered whatever sanity they had left. Dorian tried to pull her away, but the creature's form seemed to flow around her, wrapping her in a cocoon of translucent shadows, each one pulsing with a life all its own. Her screams grew louder, merging with the creature's, until her voice was no longer her own. A hollow, endless wail that tore through the room, merging with the voices of the colonists and the other rescuers who had come before them. And then, as if drawn by her suffering, the other creatures drifted closer, their shapes coalescing, merging into a single pulsing mass that radiated a cold, oppressive darkness. Dorian felt the cold fingers of despair creep into his mind, a suffocating weight that wrapped around his thoughts, crushing them, reshaping them. He could feel the creature pressing into him, filling his mind with an unbearable scream that was both his own and yet alien. A sound that burrowed into the depths of his consciousness, replacing everything he knew, everything he was. He turned, his mind fracturing, and saw Mira's face, her eyes wide and hollow as another creature latched onto her, her own voice spilling out in a desperate, hopeless wail. She reached out to him, but her hand wavered, her fingers fading into the same translucent, shimmering darkness that filled the room. Dorian stumbled back, but there was no escape. The creatures pressed in on him from all sides, each one a reflection of the team he had once commanded, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of agony. As the darkness closed in, Dorian felt his own thoughts begin to slip away, his memories fracturing, breaking apart like shards of glass. His own voice rose in a scream, joining the others in an endless nightmarish chorus that filled the colony, each echo a twisted fragment of what had once been human. The last thing he saw, as his own form began to shimmer and dissolve, was the colony's cold, empty walls, each one pulsing with the echoes of the voices it had claimed. RX-47 was no longer just an abandoned colony. It was a prison, a parasite that had consumed every soul that dared to enter, absorbing them into its darkness, leaving only their screams to haunt the empty corridors. And as his final thoughts slipped into the void, Dorian understood the truth. He was no longer Dorian. He was nothing more than another echo in RX-47's endless, inescapable nightmare. Dorian stumbled blindly through the maze of RX-47's twisting corridors, his thoughts fractured, each step feeling less certain than the last. The voices were inside him now, no longer distant whispers or haunting echoes. They had become a relentless chorus in his mind, each scream clawing into his consciousness, embedding itself like a parasite. He had lost track of how many days he'd been here, or whether his team was even still alive. The station had dissolved any sense of time, each moment stretching endlessly as the creatures fed on his thoughts, his memories, his very identity. Jin's voice cut through the clamor, a desperate, broken whisper that was both real and horribly distorted. "Commander, help me." But Dorian knew with a chilling certainty that Jin was no longer Jin. She was another echo, a shadow twisted and distorted, another scream buried in the colony's chorus. He pressed his hands against his ears, trying to drown out the voices, but they only grew louder, more insistent, filling his skull with a cacophony of pleas and cries that threatened to tear his mind apart. "They're inside you, Dorian," a voice whispered, close and familiar, yet twisted beyond recognition. It was his own voice, spoken in a tone that was both mocking and resigned. "They've been inside you since you arrived. You've always belonged to them." He dropped to his knees, gasping for breath, his mind spiraling as he struggled to hold on to something, anything, that was still his. But the memories felt foreign now, blurred around the edges, as though someone had taken them and twisted them into something unrecognizable. He tried to remember his home, the stars he had once looked at with wonder, the people he had left behind, but each image, each thought, felt distant, like a story he'd heard once, long ago, that had faded into a half-forgotten dream. The corridor around him seemed to shift, the walls pulsing with a dark, rhythmic energy that matched the pounding in his head. The creatures floated around him, translucent shapes that flickered in and out of the shadows, each one vibrating with stolen voices. They drifted closer, and he could see their faces, his team, his friends, all twisted into ghostly, hollow imitations of the people he'd known. Each face bore an expression of unspeakable agony, mouths open in a scream that never stopped. As the creatures circled him, he felt his own mind begin to unravel, the last threads of his identity slipping away, fraying under the relentless assault of memories that weren't his own. He saw flashes, moments from the lives of the colonists, from the first terrified explorers to the final desperate crew who had tried to escape. He felt their fears, their final panicked breaths, as the creatures had reached into their minds, peeling away every thought, every hope, until they were nothing more than voices echoing in the void. Dorian's own memories twisted, merging with theirs, until he could no longer tell where his own thoughts ended and theirs began. The colony was consuming him, pulling him deeper into its darkness, stripping away every piece of him, leaving only fragments of the man he had once been. He stumbled forward, reaching out blindly, hoping to find something solid, something real. But his hands passed through the air, empty, as if the walls themselves had dissolved into shadows. The station felt like a dream now, an endless maze of shifting corridors and echoing voices, each one dragging him further into oblivion. And then, as he took another step, he felt it. A presence, a cold, insidious force that wrapped itself around his mind, pulling him deeper into the dark. It wasn't just the creatures, it was RX-47 itself, alive, feeding on his fear, his despair, his very soul. He could feel it burrowing into him, filling every corner of his consciousness, until he could no longer tell if his thoughts were his own or something else entirely. In a final, desperate moment, Dorian tried to scream, but his voice was gone, lost in the sea of echoes that filled the station. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, only a hollow silence that echoed through the darkness. He was no longer Dorian. He was nothing, just another voice, another echo in the endless chorus of RX-47. The last fragment of him, the last glimmer of his humanity, dissolved into the darkness, leaving only the faint, twisted memory of who he had once been. And as his consciousness faded, he felt the colony claim him, pulling him into its depths, merging him with the voices, with the screams, until he was part of the station itself. RX-47 fell silent once more, a quiet, eerie stillness settling over the empty corridors. But in the darkness beneath the surface, the voices lingered, an endless chorus of lost souls trapped within the walls. They would wait, silent and patient, until the next rescue crew arrived, drawn to the station by the faint, distorted cries echoing through the void. And when they did, RX-47 would awaken once more, ready to consume, to add their voices to its unending song, a dark and twisted symphony of despair that would echo through the stars forever.